And I find myself at liberty, so I think I will return to the reading of The Chemical Muse by Dr. D.C.A. Hillman. And I've taken a cue from Galen's corpus and given my vocal cords a rest. I want to take care of that laryngeal nerve, you know. And let's see, where did we leave off? I think we were around page 40 or so.
No more smoking.
No, didn't get as far as I thought. It was just page 34. So here we are. Part 3. Greeks, Romans, and recreational drugs. Here's the leaf that begins all life worth having. Gilgamesh.
Inky doo-doo.
The mind can never be separated from the body. The miracle of cognition springs from the interaction of tissues, cells, and biochemical machinery, as does any other.
FYI, side note, Dr. Hillman thinks that the tale of Gilgamesh is dumber than a box of rocks. It's kind of funny. It's kind of funny, guys.
Component of human physiology. Chemicals regulate thinking no differently than they control more mundane bodily functions such as blood pressure, immunity, or reproduction. Euphoria, depression, excitement, anxiety, pleasure, and pain are all nothing more than complex chemical reactions occurring between a host of molecular agonists, antagonists, and their evolutionary programmed receptors. The science of molecular biology may be modern, but the Greeks and Romans understood the value of elementary substances found in plants and fully appreciated their ability to affect the body and the mind. Ancient civilization depended no less than does the modern world on a cadre of stimulants, antidepressants, analgesics, sleep aids, and mood enhancers, all based on the complex interactions of neurochemicals and cell receptors. 2,000 years ago, the world was ignorant of the exact science behind their drugs, but they were all well aware of the fact that plant products could dramatically alter the body's natural processes, especially cognition. Recreational drug use in the classical world is a touchy subject for most scholars. For a variety of reasons, the topic is largely taboo. It's a bit difficult for many serious academicians to imagine that the great poets, sculptors, and statesmen of Western tradition might
I
have
like
used
this guy's voice,
mind-altering
and we're
drugs.
here learning
The strong
how to
tendency
say
of
words
culture
too,
to
guy.
condemn casual drug use on moral grounds
No hate,
usually
no hate.
prevents historians from looking at antiquity with any sort of unbiased perspective. Despite a wealth of evidence that recreational drugs were in fact part of the mainstream culture of the classical world, the topic is actively ignored by the ivory tower. Classicists spend much of their time laboring diligently over the proper translation of Greek and Latin texts, but are ironically notorious for fudging the depictions of morally undesirable topics. Anything related to sex, drugs, and rock and roll is inevitably avoided, whitewashed, or just plain censored. For example, the first literal translations of Aristophanes, the infamously bawdy comic poet and author of the anti-war comedy Lysistrata, are only now beginning to roll off the presses after years of Victorian-inspired prudery among academics. Despite this traditional squeamishness about the topic of recreational drugs, a wealth of ancient literature shows that the Greco-Roman world actively indulged in numerous mind-altering substances of homegrown and foreign origins. Plants were the source of the pleasure-inducing drugs used to elevate the mood and enhance the senses. Opiates, anticholinergics, and psychotropic fungi were the drugs of choice in antiquity, but a number of unrelated toxins were also used. to create the out-of-body experiences that the Greeks and Romans so craved. It may not be pleasant for some of us to admit it, but the texts clearly show that our most original and respected thinkers flourished within a culture that wholeheartedly embraced recreational drug use. There can be no doubt that the Greeks and Romans clearly understood the mind-altering potential of specific plants. Theophrastus, the father of botany, considered the psychotropic activity of plants to be a unique characteristic of certain species. And in relation to our own persons, apart from their efforts in regard to health, disease, and death, it is said that herbs have also other properties affecting not only the bodily but also the mental powers.
Left channel. Right channel. Paired.
It's much more a declaration of common sense than of some sort of keen scientific observation. It smacks of public opinion rather than any esoteric body of knowledge possessed by medical specialists, and suggests a familiarity with the effects of non-medicinal drugs. Theophrastus was stating the obvious when he said that drugs could affect the mind and body in ways unrelated to their use in medicine, a fact that his audience took for granted. Recreational drugs were a highly visible component of ancient life. Merchants and traders bought and sold narcotics along with other medicines in the marketplaces, where the general public had ready access to a variety of exotic plants. Drug vendors and herb collectors not only sold mind-altering drugs, but also provided quasi-professional advice on matters of preparation and dosage. Psychotropics, sedatives, and analgesics, a mainstay of the ancient drug economy, were never considered odd or inappropriate for consumption by the masses. For example, Pliny classified the opium poppy as one of the garden variety plants cultivated by typical Roman families. In other words, nature's strongest narcotic was very much at home in Italian gardens, where it was planted somewhere between the innocuous parsley plant and the hardy native cabbages. Methods for administering drugs were a bit less diverse in the ancient world than they are today. Most people took recreational substances orally after mixing them with wine, which was the most common method for medical prescriptions as well.
I've read that.
The overwhelming majority of drugs were taken in this way, but the classical world also figured out other interesting methods.
The
for
dildo
ingesting
alabaster.
drugs. Subcutaneous and intravenous injections were entirely unknown, but that didn't stop the Greeks and Romans from finding different ways of getting potent pharmaceuticals into their bloodstreams. For example, drug mixtures were forcibly pushed into the nostrils in a method that could best be described as snorting. This process exposed the mucosal lining of the nasal passages to whatever drugs they didn't want to ingest directly. The Greeks and Romans also used a variety of suppositories, both anal and vaginal, where drugs could be readily absorbed. Classical scholars and ancient historians will tell you that the Greco-Roman world didn't smoke drugs in the modern sense of the word, but they're entirely wrong. Most ancient civilizations were well aware of the fact that one can assimilate the active principles of plants into their bodies through the process of inhalation. Greeks and Romans intentionally exposed themselves to the vapors of burning plants during the ancient practice of fumigation, a process whereby the drug user breathed in the fumes of various substances, anything from ordinary incense to potent herbs. This was a commonplace activity in recreational, religious, and medical settings. For example, according to Herodotus, the first Greek historian, the ancient Scythians threw parts of the marijuana plant, cannabis sativa, onto hot rocks and thereby exposed themselves to potent, mind-altering fumes, a process that made them boisterously jovial. Fumigation was a bit like secondhand smoking, not in a 21st century sort of sense, but in a crowded boardroom meeting in the late 1960s sense, from which one would emerge stinking of cigarettes and bleary-eyed. The Greeks and Romans also smoked in the modern sense of the word, directly inhaling the vapors of burning plants. For example, Pliny tells us that burning anise and breathing in its smoke through the nostrils was a cure for a headache. Although the Romans certainly didn't sit in coffee shops, slowly nursing pre-packaged cigarettes while sipping cappuccinos, and in that way didn't actually smoke in the modern, they were well aware that inhaling the smoke from certain plants could be of benefit. The classical world understood that some drugs, whether mixed in wine, snorted, or smoked, could readily alter consciousness, and considered the dramatic changes in behavior that characterized these psychotropic substances to be a form of madness or insanity. Potent drugs and hallucinogenic poisons enabled their users to violate the limits of propriety by temporarily placing them in states that were clearly out of sync with the rest of society. This pharmacologically induced psychosis made drug users rave in a manner that was typically considered to be a sign of mania. Such insanity was not always the desired result of psychotropics. Citizens of the ancient world typically used different types or smaller amounts of recreational drugs to induce mild euphoria, with no additional psychological side effects. Doctors, philosophers, and natural scientists traditionally recognized the potential for botanical drugs to have different effects on their users, including variations in potency due to the level of dosages and the natural strength of different species. One is edible and like a cultivated plant having a berry-like fruit, and there are two others, of which the one is said to induce sleep, the other to cause madness, or, if it is administered in a larger dose, death. The same thing may be observed in other plants, which are widely different. In the ancient world, drugs could have light, moderate, or dangerously severe effects. Plants could be helpful, harsh, or even harmful, depending on various factors. Antiquity's recreational drugs possessed phenomenally powerful psychotropic capacities. They were certainly no less mind-altering than most modern street drugs, including heroin, LSD, and hallucinogenic mushrooms. The Greeks and Romans were fascinated by the potentially drastic effects of their botanicals and strove to preserve an understanding of these psychotropic substances for later generations. For example, Pythagoras and Democritus journeyed to Egypt, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Persia, visiting sects of drug-using wise men known as Magi. The very same religious group that visited Jesus, according to the Gospels, and wrote extensively about the potent psychotropic substances with which they experimented. Pliny delights in vivid descriptions of these powerful, mind-altering drugs and the many diverse reasons for which they were used. The Magi use it, aglaephotis, when they wish to call upon the gods. A caminis is of an amber color, leafless, and found among the Tyradisclili of India. Criminals, if they drink it in wine, confess all their misdeeds because they suffer tortures from diverse phantoms of spirits that haunt them. The kings of Persia take it, theombrotan, in drink for all bodily disorders and for instability of intellect and of the sense of justice. The Ophiusa grows in Ethiopia, causes such terrible visions of threatening serpents that fear of them causes suicide, wherefore those guilty of sacrilege are forced to drink it.
I wonder if that's in the death inducer.
The thalassagla grows along the Indus and causes men to rave while weird visions beset their minds. The Hestia teres is a Persian plant, so named from its promotion of good fellowship, because it makes the company gay. It is also called protomedia, from its use to gain the highest position at court. Most of the plants mentioned here are identifiable today, but their effects on the brain were clearly of a psychotropic nature. Pliny makes it appear that these substances were intentionally used to induce euphoria, giddiness, and hallucinations, in the same manner as most recreational drugs today. People from all walks of life used them, from commoners to kings, and nowhere in the text are we able to detect a moral stigma attached to their use. After all, Eastern kings used potent drugs to embolden themselves and revitalize their tired spirits. One of these passages even implies that drugs helped to clarify the minds of their regal users and assisted them in making better judgments while on the throne. The Greeks and Romans were just as comfortable as the Eastern world with the non-medical use of drugs. In antiquity, the use of narcotics was never the purview of any particular social order. From commoners to aristocrats, from slaves to important government officials, everyone had access to mind-altering drugs, and nobody felt it shame to admit their dependence on narcotics. When potentially mind-altering drugs appear in ancient literature, they're never met with a flurry of apologies or any sort of embarrassment. They were just a common aspect of ancient life. For example, Plutarch, the renowned biographer of history's most prominent Greeks and Romans, tells us of an incident of drug use during the Roman Civil War of the 1st century BC that aptly illustrates antiquity's attitude of detached indifference to the subject. He, Julius Caesar, then marched against Domitius, who was holding at Corfinium with a force of 30 cohorts. Caesar pitched his camp near the city, and Domitius, despairing of
Been up
being
since
able to
4
defend
a.m.
asked his doctor, who was a slave of his, to give him poison. He took the dose that was given him and drank it with the intention of putting an end to his life.
I think it's probably about 8 p.m. now. We got like an hour left on this part of the reading.
He then began to
So,
bewail his
I
fate
think,
and to reproach himself for having
time
been
for
too
gloves on.
hasty in coming to this resolution. His doctor, however, cheered him up by informing him that what he had drunk was not poison at all, but only a sleeping drug, a hypnotic drug. Domitius was delighted. Hypnotics are a specific class of sleep-inducing drugs that include strong narcotics and sedatives. The passage is interesting for two reasons. Not only was there no apparent social concern for using strong narcotics, but it also seems that the slave had a readily available supply of the drug, just for the general's personal use. Perhaps Domitius was accustomed to taking the drug as a sort of sedative, a pharmaceutical means of dealing with the most rigorous politics of the 1st century BC, just as Persian tyrants consumed drugs to meet the demands of kingship. Drugs may have been a potent coping mechanism for Titan generals and Eastern potentates, but the pharmaceutical promise of euphoria had its limits in antiquity, just as it does today. That is, our texts show the classical world was well aware of the phenomenon known as drug tolerance. Theophrastus warned his readers of this easily observable fact. The virtues, powers of all drugs become weaker to those who are accustomed to them, and in some cases become entirely ineffective. Although the Greco-Roman world had no concepts like drug addiction or substance abuse, they clearly recognized the body's tendency to grow accustomed to certain drugs, thus creating a requirement for higher dosages in order to achieve the same results. The aforementioned passage is critical to our understanding of ancient drug use, because it implies that there was a segment of the population that took drugs frequently enough to induce tolerance. In other words, antiquity had its own chemically dependent addicts. But because ancient legislators never outlawed the sale of narcotics nor declared non-medical use to be immoral, drug addiction, in the modern sense of the word, never truly existed. The Greeks and Romans clearly abused drugs in a modern sense, but they just didn't consider it to be associated with heavy recreational drug use to be of social or spiritual concern. Persistent drug users didn't present significant social obstacles. In fact, it may seem strange to us that drug sellers were consistently criticized for adulterating their products and selling valueless drugs. The drug users were never portrayed in a bad light. Accordingly, there are no words in Latin or Greek for junkie, hophead, or dope fiend. Those are modern concepts. The opium poppy, Papaver somnifera, is one of the oldest known cultivated plants, and may even be the first botanical substance used for both medical and recreational purposes. Neolithic settlements bear witness to the long history of human involvement with opium, where remains of the poppy have been found in Swiss pile-dwelling villages. The earliest evidences for the presence of poppy cultivation reaches back as far as the 4th millennium BC. It's likely that opium was used far earlier than that. Many Near Eastern cultures provide us with information regarding the widespread presence of the opium poppy in the ancient world, including Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Egyptians, who knew about the valuable application of poppy and actively promoted its cultivation through their lands. Farther west, archaeological remains from Mycenae in Greece and the island of Crete, both of which had Bronze Age cultures, bear striking depictions of
FYI, I am obsessed with the island of Crete and the Minotaur and Theseus.
Of the poppy's capsule, which was the recognized source of the drug. Depictions of the capsule were meant to symbolize the juice of the poppy, much like fruits were made to represent the trees from which they came. These artistic images signify the widespread presence of opium in early Greek times. Late Bronze Age Cypriot people made small vases shaped like the poppy capsule for purposes of trade with Egypt. Scholars believe their distinct shapes provide us with an explanation of the contents they once held. Merchants from Cyprus probably sold these compact containers filled with opium dissolved in wine to their customers in Egypt. Their small size may indicate they were specifically designed for personal use. Such evidence points to the existence of a vibrant drug trade in the Mediterranean long before the rise of classical Greco-Roman society. Egypt eventually became famous for its cultivation and preparation of drugs and was undoubtedly one of the best sources of opium in antiquity. The Greeks, who traded with the East, inherited much of their traditional awareness of the potency of botanicals from the Egyptians. They may have learned of the analgesic and sleep-inducing qualities of opium from the physicians and poppy cultivators in the land of the pharaohs, or they may simply have picked up the habit from Crete, Cyprus, or other parts of Asia Minor, where the drug was also popular. Regardless of its exact geographical origins, the poppy eventually made its way to Greece and Italy, where it was warmly embraced by Hellenic and Italic cultures and quickly absorbed into their art and literature. Extracting opium from the poppy is an age-old practice. Today's poppy farmers in Afghanistan collect opium in a manner almost identical to that used by the Greeks and Romans 2,000 years ago. The process is relatively simple but requires a pinch of agricultural know-how and some botanical savvy. Pliny the Elder described the process of collecting opium. From the dark poppy, a soporific is obtained by making incisions in the stalk. When the buds are forming, as Diagoras advises, or when the flowers are falling, as Arolas recommends. At the third hour of a clear day, that is to say, when the dew on the plant is dried up, both this juice and that of any other plant is gathered and milled, or if there be by scratching it off. Poppy juice, however, being copious, thickens, and squeezed into lozenges is dried in the shade. It is not only a soporific, but if too large a dose is swallowed, the sleep even ends in death. It is called opium. Evidence like this not only makes it clear that opium is a valuable and widespread commodity. Excuse me. Where did I leave off here? Evidence
Bro,
like this
fucking
not only
trip me
makes
out,
it
bro.
clear that opium was a valuable and widespread commodity in the ancient world, but also alerts us to the fact that great civilizations of the past, unlike modern Western nations, felt no compulsion
Locking
to
my door
criminalize
now.
strong narcotics.
Freaks me out, buddy.
Pliny, a well-respected member of the Roman aristocracy, was not ashamed to possess such a detailed understanding of the best methods for producing narcotics. Recreational drugs did not bear the stigma assigned them by the modern West. The juice of poppy contains numerous intoxicants that attracted the drug-loving Greco-Roman world. The most potent are morphine and its close chemical relative, codeine. Morphine, which derives its name from Morpheus, the Greek god of nerves, is an alkaloid that acts upon groups of highly specific receptors found in the human brain, involved in pain and pleasure sensation. And in fact, the human nervous system possesses its own biochemical machinery that specifically binds the chemical constituents of opium in a basic lock and key fashion. Scientists call these brain molecules opioid receptors because they bind morphine and a number of related chemical messengers. Once these receptors are activated, they bring about a myriad of changes in brain function. These alterations are responsible for the analgesia, and the euphoria that is felt by those who are under the influence of opiates. Morphine levels in opium tend to fluctuate, like the alcohol in different wines, so samples of raw opium latex typically vary in strength. The efficacy of any particular batch of opium in antiquity relied almost exclusively on the morphine concentrations found in the plant's capsule from which the drug was taken, so determining dosages of the drug was an unreliable process. Unintentional overdoses of strong drugs like opium strengthened the need for antidotes made from numerous plants. The morphine found in opium acts on the brain to enhance feelings of pleasure and to decrease pain perception. But as any morphine user will tell you, the drug doesn't abolish pain sensations altogether. It simply mitigates the response to pain. That is, morphine acts upon neural pathways involved in pain interpretation rather than just pain perception. Under normal circumstances, the nervous system relays information about bodily injury to the brain, where different nuclei interpret these signals and determine the proper response. But under the influence of opium, pain-sensing nerves send their messages directly to the nervous system, but the brain perceives these signals in a different biochemical unit. That is to say, thanks to opium, we feel pain, but we just don't care. This makes morphine an incredibly effective treatment for traumatic injury. The true power of opium, the source of its lasting grip, and the source of its lasting grip on the soul of humanity, is certainly this profound ability to relieve pain. No drug, no form of medicine, no man-made chemical, no school of Eastern meditation, no shamanism, no alternative means of healing, crystals, positive thinking, law, can even begin to rival the analgesic capacity of opium. Thousands of years of human history would reveal it to be the best of all narcotics, in the truest sense of the word, not from the Greek to numb. For the founders of Western society, life without opium would have been impossible. Opium enabled humanity to push beyond the pain of existence. It enabled its users to look beyond mundane agony to a world of sublime serenity. Classical writers tell us this precious narcotic caused deep and intense stupor, like that brought on by excessive alcohol intoxication. A man who drinks his wine like a thirsty horse lapping up its water, senselessly babbles. He can't pronounce his words properly. The drunkard lies there at the bottom of his cup, not saying a word, completely stupefied, like a man who just drank the drug opium. The idea here is that opium placed its user in a mental stupor. It was not a coma, but a state of intense lethargy, characterized by mental detachment. Latin authors joined words like sorrow, sleep, insomnus, and stupor, torpor, to descriptions of poppies and opium. Sopor and somnus both denote types of sleep, but the former signified a deep or overpowering sleep, while the latter referred to regular nighttime sleeping. The Romans typically referred to the day's state of opium intoxication as sopor. English reflects similar ideas in its use of words like stone and high, which are universally recognized as specific terms of drug-related vocabulary. Opium's physical effects were so widely recognized in Italy that the Roman world created its own epithet for the poppy. They referred to it as Sopiferum papaver, the sleep-inducing poppy. Although the Latin language also possessed the adjective somniferum to represent the concept of sleep-inducing, soporiferum dominates literary references to the poppy, which shows that the Romans tried to distinguish the strong narcotic effects of opium from the non-narcotic effects of other drugs that induce sleep. Once again, the ancient world was unashamed of its intimate familiarity with the effects of opium intoxication and aimed to clarify rather than disguise them. The physiological effects of opium are universally understood in antiquity due to the ubiquity of the drug, but it has largely disappeared from public view today, and therefore few people know much about its intoxicating effects. Fortunately for the English-speaking world, a 19th century gentleman, classical scholar, gifted writer, and self-proclaimed opium user devoted an entire work to the effects of the drug. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater is a masterly depiction of the profound psychological effects of the narcotic. It describes the opium trip in astounding detail and preserves the exotic experiences of using the world's most popular drug. De Quincey believed opium created a paradise for those who used it. Accordingly, he called the druggist who introduced him to opium an unconscious minister of celestial pleasures. He took drops of opium dissolved in alcohol, a popular 19th century version of the drug known as laudanum, which banished his pain and granted him profound feelings of serenity. De Quincey denied that any form of depression followed opium use and vehemently defended the opium user's ability to function normally within a society, a blatant contradiction to the modern view of the habitual drug user as a dysfunctional and potentially dangerous individual. The poppy, in Greek, makon, in Latin, papaver, was cultivated for its seeds as well as opium, but the use of the plant's name is usually a reference to the drug. Greek and Roman physicians typically name the poppy with the drug itself, and thus they rarely speak of the actual process of collecting latex and preparing crude opium. Their prescriptions of pain-killing medications typically list the poppy as the recipe's primary anodyne, and frequently omit any awkward or unnecessary details that would tend to confuse their audiences. From the word mekon, the Greeks developed a number of highly charged terms. For example, meconium and meconeon. Meconeon both represented the juice derived from the poppy capsule, or opium. The former was even used to denote the bowel contents of newborn babies, something known today as meconium, because of its dark brown color and sticky texture. Opium must have been ubiquitous in antiquity, or the Greeks would not have made such a linguistic hullabaloo about the obvious similarities. The English word opium derives from its Latin ancestor, opium, which was itself taken from the Greek word opion, Opium originally signified the juice of any plant. Opium.
You do it so many
originally
times,
signified
and then you get
juice
lazy
of
one
any plant,
time
but
and injure
eventually
yourself.
came to mean just
No
the
good.
juice of the poppy. In other words, the Greeks referred to their popular drug of choice as juice, just as marijuana today is euphemistically known as weed. Although common expressions like this generally indicate some sort of taboo associated with the terms they come to represent, the Greeks used the word opion because it was the most widely recognized plant juice of their culture. Stated simply, the drug opium was so well known in antiquity that the Greeks just referred to it as the juice. The Greeks also used the term diacodium for opium. Diacodium. Codia. The root of this philological queer word. Let me repeat. Diacodium for opium. Codia. The root of this philologically queer word means plant capsule. It was commonly used to represent the opium poppy's distinctively shaped, seed-filled structure. In this way, it seems opium was occasionally associated with the poppy's most prominent feature, the source of the drug. The preposition dia can simply intensify a word it precedes, so in English, diacodion might have been something like head. Not any old head of a plant, but the head. It is quite rare to refer to opium this way in writing, which may tell that diacodion, some sort of slang term for the drug, used only in private circles and directly akin to our use of bud or marijuana. Wow, the head. Fascinating. In his Peloponnesian War, Thucydides shows that opium is valuable enough to tempt brave men to risk their own lives. The Greek word for poppy, melton, in this passage has traditionally been translated poppy seed to avoid portraying the Greeks as drug users. In a heated battle at Pylos, the Athenians besieged the Spartans, hoping to starve them into submission. But a number of brave helots, the servants of the Spartans, managed to sneak life-saving provisions onto the island and into the hands of their grateful masters. Thucydides tells us that the poppy was one of these valuable provisions, but modern classicists want us to believe this episode had nothing to do with drugs. The fact was that the Spartans had called for volunteers to bring into the island ground corn, wheat, wine, cheese, and any other form of food and is useful in siege. There were many ready to take the risk of doing so. Divers also swam in underwater from the harbor, dragging behind them by a cord skins containing poppy seed mixed with honey and pounded linseed. Translations like this make it appear that the wounded Spartans were desperate for baked goodies topped with tasty poppy seeds. In reality, the Spartans had been caught up in hand-to-hand combat with the Athenians and were defending themselves against a relentless assault. So they undoubtedly had many injured soldiers who were in dire need of medical attention. If we translate the word poppy, melton, as opium, the passage makes much more sense. The brave divers risked their lives to bring their comrades opium in order to treat the sick and the wounded. The context of the rest of the passage appears to bear this out, for opium was so foul-tasting that it was often mixed with honey, and linseed oil was a common ingredient found in salves and poultices designed to treat wounds. It's far more reasonable to conclude then that the Helots were trying to sneak medical supplies to their injured countrymen, not poppy seeds. The Spartan warriors were in need of painkillers, not pastries. Aristotle, the famous philosopher, student of Plato, and personal tutor of Alexander the Great, also wrote about the powers of opium, not the powers of poppy seeds. In a short work titled On Sleep, he discussed altered states of consciousness, including stupor, drowsiness, and normal sleep. Considering the things that induce sleep, they all, whether potable or edible, for instance, poppy, mandragora, wine, darnel, produce a heaviness in the head, and persons borne down and nodding all seem affected in this way. They are unable to lift up the head or the eyelids. It's clear from the passage that his audience must have had some exposure to the drug as well. Otherwise, it would be odd for him to try to use it as an illustration of his point. Like Thucydides, Aristotle used the Greek term melton here to refer to the drug. Once again, the passage makes little sense with any other translation of the word. Poppy seeds do not have the same effect as mandrake, a strong anesthetic, or large quantities of wine. In fact, poppy seed confections would never cause a person to enter the stupor described here. Aristotle was certainly referring to opium in this passage, and he used the generic word poppy to do so. He assumed his audience would understand that it was the drug, not the plant, to which he was referring. When the Romans wanted to place special emphasis on the actual juice of the poppy, rather than mention just the plant itself, they used the exquisite term lacrimae papaveris, or tears of the poppy. Such expressive terminology sounds far better suited to poetry than to medical treatises, but physicians employed it as a technical term to represent the juice of the opium poppy. Poppy tears was medical jargon for opium. The various contexts in which the word poppy or papaver is embedded in Latin literature makes it possible to conclude most of these passages refer explicitly to the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and not its non-narcotic relatives. Sometimes Roman authors speak of the medicinal value of opium as a treatment for pain, but much of the time the drug appears as a non-medical means of altering consciousness. That is, like their Greek neighbors, the Romans used opium for recreational purposes. This is significant because all three of our surviving authorities on Roman agriculture, Cato, Varro, and Columella, mentioned the poppy and discussed various issues surrounding its usefulness and cultivation. These three men wrote extensively about the proper use of land and resources for farming and compiled agricultural manuals, early farmers' almanacs, a type of prose composition that became quite popular in Rome, the Farmer's Almanac. Farmers were the backbone of ancient civilizations and typically remained more conservative than their cosmopolitan counterparts, as they do today. For example, Cato the Elder, one of the aforementioned authors, was known near and far as a paragon of old-time virtues and traditional values. He was a bit of a xenophobe who didn't trust his Greek neighbors, but one thing he did trust was opium. Cato unabashedly encouraged farmers to plant poppies, no doubt as an alternative to buying expensive painkillers in the Roman markets, for he was notoriously cheap. Poppies made a limited number of appearances in the works of Latin poets like Catullus, Ovid, Horace, Propertius, and Virgil, but they truly impressed the natural historian Pliny, who mentioned them over 50 times in his own writings. Pliny described all aspects of the plant, including specific physical descriptions, the proper way to collect opium latex, and medicinal uses of the drug. When he referred to opium, he typically used the Latin word for poppy, papaver. And lest we should be led astray by scholars who want us to think that the Romans valued the poppy just for the scrumptious seeds, we should consider that Pliny used the Latin word opium and its derivative meconium, which can only refer to the drug opium, several dozen times in his natural history. Like the opium poppy, wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, is just another plant that contains psychotropic chemicals. It is one of several hundred related plants belonging to a single genus known as Artemisia. Artemis artemisia. In antiquity, it was widely recognized for
The
its
wormwood is also another name for the center of
Wormwood's
the
pungent
galaxy.
aroma and hideously noxious flavor gave it such a bad name that even the author of the biblical book of Revelation made it into an apocalyptic tool of the divine wrath of God upon sinful mankind. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Great quote. Wormwood, southernwood, mugwort, and Roman wormwood are all unremarkable shrubby plants. Unremarkable shrubby plants. Common wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, has been used for centuries as a mental stimulant and an anxiolytic, a drug that quells the anxiety. In addition, the Greeks and Romans made a special wine with this bitter plant. According to Pliny, ancient physicians prescribed wormwood wine far too frequently, but this perceived abuse of the drug did not prevent him from discussing the best method for making it. The chemical responsible for wormwood's physiological effects is something called fujon. This drug produces mind-altering effects in humans, commonly described as feelings of self-confidence and an impression of artistic inspiration. On a molecular level, fujon is simply a potent neurotoxin. This means that wormwood consumption can be a dangerous proposition. But this risk seems to have eluded the classical world entirely. The fact that fujon is so soluble in alcohol explains why the Greeks and Romans boiled leaves from the plant in wine in order to make their drug. The emerald green of wormwood's volatile oil enticed some of Western civilization's greatest thinkers and inspired many of its artists. Absolutely. Common wormwood wasn't just a street drug. It was nothing less than a household commodity in antiquity. Plautus, the famous Roman playwright, used the plant to highlight the stupidity and ignorance of one of his characters, who didn't know, unlike everyone else in the world, that the wormwood came from Pontus. After all, why would they have called it Pontic wormwood? This foolish character was obviously out of the know and lacked proper social refinement. Ovid, the Roman poet, while in exile in Pontus, also couldn't help but mention the famous plant that grew like a weed there. We have no trees, but only stunted, sickly things, no taller than brushes, so that the land is bare as the sea, brown, otherwise the same waste space. Springs here bubble forth with sulphurous water that leaves you thirsty as ever, and the birds don't sing, but only croak like frogs or chirp, like the bugs that swarm in wormwood, the only crop of this accursed place. He may have been critical of the region's depressingly un-Roman attributes, but he did acknowledge that wormwood was at least a useful agricultural commodity. Lucretius, a 1st century BC Epicurean poet, mentions wormwood in his great work, On the Nature of Things. He tells us that the unsavory odor of wormwood and other particularly stinky plants could be detected by rubbing their leaves between one's fingers. Doing this would have liberated wormwood's volatile oil and thereby produced a strong odor. Of course, wormwood certainly smelled bad, but it also tasted terrible. Lucretius presents a vivid picture of the means Roman physicians used to fool the discriminating taste buds of a sick child. But even as healers, when they essaying to give loathsome wormwood to children, first touched the rim all around the cup with a sweet golden mixture of honey, so that the unwitting age of children may be beguiled as far as the lips, and meanwhile they drink the bitter draught of wormwood, and though charmed, may not be harmed, but rather by such means may be restored and come to heaven. Once again, like opium, foul-tasting drugs were often mixed with honey in order to make them a bit more palatable. Wormwood wine must have been quite harsh on the palate, but this never stopped the ancient world from drinking it.
50
Lucretius'
minutes.
interest in wormwood may not have been just a passing fancy. Jerome, a later Christian scholar, tells us that Lucretius suffered from fits of insanity brought about by a drug that his wife gave him. This juicy story is tempting because we know that absinthe, an alcoholic concoction made from wormwood, was banned in the early 20th century due to the suspicion that it deranged chronic users. The neurotoxin responsible for the narcotic effects of the plant is undoubtedly responsible for perceived alterations in behavior and personality. Whether Lucretius was personally involved with wormwood or not, one thing is certain. Tradition has it that some sort of drug drove him temporarily insane. The madness associated with a strong neurotoxin like that found in wormwood was not the only psychedelic chemical experience available to the world of antiquity. Marijuana was a common drug, possibly imported by Roman merchants from the Scythians or even India. In fact, cannabis was so popular that the ancient world used it in both human medicine and animal husbandry. According to Pliny, the juice of the plant was used to kill parasites, numb the pain of arthritis, and settle the stomachs of domestic animals. That's right. The Romans gave cannabis to their cattle. It may be for a modern audience. It may be difficult for a modern audience to accept such practices, but Roman farmers were practical, and if it hadn't helped their animals, they would never have used it. As a drug, marijuana was effective in treating a number of morbid conditions. Many potent psychotropic substances were considered to be potentially poisonous, but cannabis was never vilified. The ancient world clearly trusted the drug as much as they did any other safe medication. Marijuana, opium poppies, and wormwood all contain potent chemicals that change perception, but they were not the only mind-altering drugs available in antiquity. The Greeks and Romans also used anticholinergics, a group of strong chemicals characterized by an ability to interrupt normal neural transmission. Two of these drugs, atropine and scopolamine, are frequently used by modern anesthesiologists in a chemically purified form, but they were originally found in a large family of plants known by the common name nightshade. A variety of species like henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, belladonna, Atropa belladonna, mandrake, Atropa mandragora, and jimsonweed, Datura stramonium, produce atropine, scopolamine, and other potent alkaloids that were used to produce hallucinations, euphoria, and generalized delirium. These plants thrived in the Mediterranean, and Theophrastus was well aware of their potent effects. Of the plants called strychnos, possibly belladonna, one induces sleep, the other, jimsonweed, causes madness. The kind which produces madness has a white, hollow root about a cubit long. Of this, 3/20 of an ounce in weight is given. If the patient is to become merely sportive and to think himself a fine fellow, twice this dose if he is to go mad outright and have delusions, thrice the dose if he is to be permanently insane. 4 times the dose is given if the man is to be killed. Anticholinergic drug-producing plants like belladonna and jimsonweed caused changes in mental perception and cognition that were also potentially lethal. They possessed the benign ability to elevate one's mood, which made them excellent recreational drugs, but they were also quite deadly. The psychotropic effects of anticholinergics have been well documented by the modern world, particularly in cases of severe atropine and scopolamine intoxication. Physicians use the acronym CAS, CAS, Central Anticholinergic Syndrome, to describe symptoms that result from overdoses with these drugs. They include hallucinations, psychosis, delirium, confusion, disorientation, and generalized stupor. In other words, when the classical world talked about the ability of certain drugs to cause mania and insanity, they weren't resorting to hyperbole. Nightshade plants literally drove their users to the brink of insanity, allowing them to visualize both the most pleasant and the most horrific aspects of the human imagination. Hallucinations and delirium, as modern cognitive phenomena, are not generally associated with negative experiences like acute psychosis. However, mental derangements can also be distinctly pleasurable. Many ancient cultures actively sought out drugs that can induce mental confusion for the sake of their perceived spiritual potentials. Hallucinogens and other psychotropics create the impression that abstract creations of the mind, things like heaven, hell, spirits, and demons, can be visualized or perhaps even personally experienced. Hallucinogens breathe life into the fears, hopes, and dreams of mankind. They traditionally pave the way for divine visions. The potential for metaphysical transcendence offered by anticholinergics. Anticholinergics. It's hard to say that one. Anticholinergics was an inescapable temptation for classical cultures. These plants gave the ancient world the chance to interact more closely with the gods they created and worshipped. Mind-altering activity of anticholinergics, as appealing as it must have been, often came with a significant cost. However, like many other toxic substances, the widespread use of these drugs proves that their benefits far outweigh the obvious risks. Nightshade plants had too much to offer classical civilization. Their utility forever ensured their place in ancient society. Pliny tells of the dangers involved in using them, but he felt no moral responsibility to refrain from discussing the proper methods for using them. It, henbane, has the character of wine, and therefore injures the head and brain. Use is made of the seed as it is when the juice has been extracted from it. The juice is extracted separately also from the stems and leaves. They also use the root. What the drug is, in my opinion, a dangerous medicine in any form. In fact, it is well known that even the leaves affect the brain if more than 4 are taken in a day. And oil is made from the seed, as I have said, which by itself, if poured into the ears, deranges the brain. Sounds like Shakespeare to me. Despite his cautionary warning about plants like henbane, Pliny still felt comfortable enough to describe the proper means of isolating and harvesting them. The Romans spread their interest in psychotropic drugs like henbane to their neighbors in the Mediterranean. They took their narcotics with them to the limits of their frontiers, where these medical and recreational substances undoubtedly served to distract the soldiers who served to secure the borders of Roman political power. For example, the Romans probably introduced or at least reinforced the widespread use of mind-altering drugs to the peoples of Britain. According to one scholar, mandrake, opium, and henbane were all found near Oxford at an archaeological site dating to the Iron Age and to Roman settlements. The presence of other hallucinogenic compounds that predate the Roman occupation make it likely that the locals were well aware of the power of certain plants, but the Romans certainly approved of the practice of using drugs for recreational and religious reasons. Many of the psychotropic substances taken from botanicals in antiquity may have been hazardous, but once again they were neither criminalized nor deemed immoral. Pliny considered the nightshades to be just another group of potent, mind, and body-altering chemicals. His nonchalant approach is clearly a reflection of antiquity's objective approach to drug use. Now, I should have noted that this part, this book written by Dr. Hillman, this was based upon his treatise for his doctorate, right? And since so much of this that I'm reading was actually cut from it and extracted, it likely, in the process, was never given fully edited. So if you see missing words and things like that and you stumbling over them, that's a big part of that. So let's see if we can get this right. How should it go? Many of the psychotropic substances taken from botanicals in antiquity may have been hazardous, but once again, they were neither criminalized nor deemed immoral. Pliny considered the nightshades to be just another group of potent mind and body altering substances or plants. His nonchalant approach is clearly a reflection of antiquity's objective approach to drug use. The maniacal rush caused by high doses of anticholinergics must be something similar to that experienced while under the influence of LSD. After taking a large quantity of anticholinergic drugs, the skin quickly flushes, the mouth becomes dry, and vision is impaired. The person becomes restless, giddy, disoriented, and somewhat confused. This bewilderment can be quickly transformed into a potentially nightmarish experience, characterized by frightening hallucinations, severe agitation, and complete psychosis. Depending on the dosage administered, coma and seizures can follow.
Also known as life.
Why the Romans considered the drug to be highly dangerous. Regardless of such obvious hazards, classical cultures actively used anticholinergic chemicals found in common plants to induce drastic mind-altering states. The nightshade trip, with its promise of temporary insanity, was pleasurable enough to necessitate the widespread dissemination of specific knowledge concerning its use and outrageous effects. Nightshade was easy to identify in antiquity, so those who resorted to taking it were well aware of what they were getting into. But mushrooms were an entirely different story. The ancient world recognized the psychoactive properties of certain fungi and the seemingly magical power they possessed, but they were equally aware of the fact that they could be lethal. Classical authors repeatedly warned against the use of certain mushrooms and provide complicated remedies for those who found themselves poisoned by them. Antidotes for mushrooms are often the same as those for nightshade, which is a good indication that the Greeks and Romans believed their hallucinatory capacities to be somehow related. Mushrooms were so prevalent that even emperors were fond of them. In fact, at the time of his demise, it was widely believed that the Roman Emperor Claudius somehow died of mushroom poisoning. Opiates, anticholinergics, and mushrooms were certainly among most popular drugs in antiquity. But the Greeks and Romans also experimented with a wide variety of toxins derived from plants, substances that most cultures accept as strictly poisonous. Most of these drugs were deadly when used in excess, but many could be used to induce altered states of mind at a low dosage. For example, hemlock, Conint maculata, was used by the Athenians as a standard tool for carrying out executions. Contains strong chemicals capable of suppressing vital activities of the central nervous system. It can be lethal, as Socrates discovered, but taken in small quantities, the drug can also produce in the body useful effects. commonly perceived to be pleasurable or even euphoric. In other words, hemlock, Antiquity's attempt at lethal injection, could also have been used as an excellent sedative, taken in wine after a hard day's work. It would calm the nerves and relax tense muscles, taking the edge off the stress of everyday life. As crazy as it sounds, Greeks sitting around sipping hemlock toddies, this is exactly what the literary evidence on poisons and antidotes seems to indicate. The use of toxic plants was a complex subject in antiquity, where doctors and street vendors debated the specifics about the proper administration of many potentially fatal substances. In what appears to be a busy and complex world of poisons, antidotes, and counterpoisons, Greek and Roman authors demonstrate a vast understanding of the use of these drugs, despite their potential lethality. Pliny's report on one drug is particularly intricate. An overdose of this juice from the plant known as rue possesses poisonous qualities. Strangely enough, it is neutralized by the juice of hemlock. So there are actual poisons of poisons, and hemlock juice is good for the hands and face of those who gather rue. Any sort of rue, however, is even by itself a powerful antidote. The kind that leaves being taken in wine, especially against aconite and mistletoe. Likewise, whether given in drink or in food, against poisonous fungi. These things give us a lot of insights as to so many of the myths. And, you might think of a particular myth involving the death of Balder here. And what the truth behind this that the good doctor is revealing,
I
what
can't
does
even
it
see.
reveal about the true nature of most of, or much of our mythos. The context of this quote is extremely complex, especially for a modern audience that is largely inexperienced in the use of botanical curatives. Pliny says rue can be used as an antidote against aconite and mistletoe, both of which contain lethal toxins, but he adds that it can also be poisonous itself, unless one uses another dangerous poison, hemlock, while gathering it. The passage is a bit confusing, but it shows us that the ancient world was truly invested in the use of drug plants, and yet their knowledge of plants was as varied as rue, hemlock, aconite, and even mistletoe was exceptionally detailed. Scholars who are not pharmacists love to translate these texts and provide erudite commentaries on the political events reflected in them, but they rarely ask utterly simple questions about the motives for ingesting such odd substances. For years, ancient literature on the use of antidotes has been marginalized, if not entirely ignored by the classics community. For example, the works of Nicander, an obscure Greek poet who probably lived sometime in the late 2nd century BC, are standard topics for serious discussion among noted scholars. His Alexipharmachia is generally considered to be a short and uninspired didactic poem on the dangers of specific poisons and the various medicines used to counteract their harmful effects on the body. Most academics consider the work a clever but unimpressive treatise on the use of antidotes administered in cases of poisoning, when crafty political rivals did away with their enemies by slipping them a mighty thin. Although murder by poison was certainly not uncommon in antiquity, especially in Rome with the eventual rise of powerful aristocratic families and the decline of republicanism, it's a bit of a stretch to think that Nicander's work is nothing more than an extensive examination of the art of homicide. Many of the drugs mentioned in the Alexipharmachia, opium for one, were potent psychotropics, and thus excellent candidates for use as recreational drugs. In fact, there are so many references to poisons in the work and such explicit descriptions
my new
of the
glasses
symptoms
tomorrow.
involved in using the drugs,
I
it
like
is safe
these.
to
I get
conclude
a lot of
that
compliments
the
on my
Alexipharmachia is
copper-
not about poisons
my
at
copper
all.
band.
On the contrary, it makes much more sense if we look at it as a work on the treatment of intentional drug overdoses
Now I can see.
rather than malicious poisonings.
Yep, I
In
suck.
addition, When medical authors listed antidotes to common poisons like opium, henbane, wild mushrooms, hemlock, and something euphemistically known as bull's blood, they most likely were talking more about the treatment of overdoses than political intrigue. Good examples of our misinterpretation of ancient antidote texts present themselves in Nikender's Alexipharmacy. For example, in one passage, Nikender describes the symptoms of exposure to arrow poison, a potent battlefield toxin used in weaponry to increase the likelihood of an enemy combats death. However, he claims the remedies are made specifically for those who ingest the drug. It's striking that he fails to mention anything about warfare, weapons, or battle injuries, but he refers strictly to those who drink arrow poison. There are even means of promptly averting oppression caused by deadly arrow poison when a man is overcome with anguish from drinking. First, his tongue begins to thicken from the root and weighs upon the lips, which are heavy and swollen about the mouth. He suffers from dry expectoration, and his gums break open from the base. Often, too, his heart is smitten with palpitations, and it is his fate that all his wits are stunned and overthrown by the evil poison, and he makes bleeding noises, babbling endlessly in his frenzy. Often, too, in his distress, he cries aloud as one whose head, the body's master, has just been cut off with the sword, or as the acolyte with her tray of offerings. Rhea's priestess, appearing in the public highways on the 9th day of the month, raises a great shout with her voice, while the people tremble as they hearken to the horrible yelling of the votary of Ida. Even so, the man in his frenzy of mind bellows and howls incoherently as he glances sidelong like a bull. He whets his white teeth and foams at the jaws. It's hard to believe that ancient malefactors slipped arrow poison into each other's drinks so frequently that poets like
The
Milton
malefactor is
were
actually
able
the
to
name of my
describe their
first
victims' symptoms
title,
in such vivid detail.
first chapter of my
Yet this is
title of the
exactly
first chapter.
what classical scholars want us to believe. On the contrary, it's far more
What,
likely
don't believe
that the
me?
symptoms of arrow
You don't
poison
believe me?
intoxication were well known.
You don't
Because
believe
Greeks
me?
and Romans commonly used the toxin as a recreational drug, and therefore the general public was familiar with the effects of the overdoses. Nikender's audience, the educated, erudite, and priestly classes of his community, were very much aware of the fact that drugs could be used to alter consciousness, but they also knew their potential lethality. This passage is just one of Nikender's many descriptions of the dangerous drug effects of popular recreational drugs, something the classical world used to numb the pain and hardship of life. This passage has another significance. It's no coincidence that Nikender, who is believed to have been a priest of Apollo, compared arrow poison intoxication to the strange behavior of certain religious acolytes. The odd manners and activities of rapturous worshippers was a favorite topic of classical poets, historians, and playwrights alike. In fact, Nikender helps to show us that drugs and cultic practices often went hand in hand, and many episodes of crazed behavior in classical literature can be directly linked to the influence of drugs. The mother of all drug-using cults in antiquity, the cult of Dionysus, the god of the vine, was heavily steeped in the dark lore surrounding the god's frenzied devotees and their mysterious ritual ecstasy. Euripides, the great 5th century Athenian tragedian, even wrote an entire play on the topic called The Bacchae. In it, he tells the sad story of Pentheus, a Theban king who refuses to worship the god Dionysus and pays for his impiety with his life. At the opening of the play, Dionysus, whose followers engage in strange orgiastic rituals, has already spread his influence across the East and now threatens to invade mainland Greece with his novel religion. Despite the god's surging popularity, Pentheus arrogantly denies him a place of honor in the Greek pantheon. As a result, Dionysus drives the king out of his mind,
I created
dresses
this
him up as a woman under
when I was
false
still a
pretenses,
teenager.
and then inspires a group of his celebrants, including Pentheus' own mother, to tear the sacrilegious tyrant to pieces. Of course, all of this trickery is possible because Dionysus has the power to induce mania, as Euripides' chorus tells us. When the man, Pentheus, stands within the cast of our net, he will come to the Bacchae and pay the penalty of death. Dionysus, now the
Damn
end is yours, for you are not far off. Let us punish him. First put him outside the mind, instill a light-headed frenzy, since if he reasons well, he definitely won't be willing to dress in a woman's costume. But if he drives off the road out of reason, he will dress up. Not only was Dionysus able to instill his followers with ecstatic frenzy, but he also had the power to drive his enemies out of their minds. In fact, you could say he was the god of temporary insanity. As a manic deity, Euripides
Still fucking fat.
Dionysus actually possessed his followers, who in essence drank up the god as they would a glass of wine, or perhaps wine mixed with recreational drugs. From within these divinely possessed individuals, the god worked his maddening magic and gave mortals profound insight. The god is also prophet, though the ecstatic and the manic have mantic powers in large measure. When the god enters someone in force, he causes him in madness to predict the future. It's remarkable that Dionysus was portrayed as a god who transferred his power to his followers by entering within their physical bodies. For in the Greek religious pantheon, possession was truly anomalous. Except for the spirit of the war god Ares, or perhaps the prophetic aspects of Apollo, the Olympians never traditionally possessed anyone. They persuaded, commanded, tricked, or confused mortals in order to get their way. But they were entirely unaccustomed to the idea of close communion with the flesh of any mortal, which was certainly beneath them. However, Dionysus actually possessed his followers, and Euripides' Greek audience clearly equated this fact with the use of mind-altering drugs. For example, concerning Pentheus, Euripides writes, "You are mad, and most painfully so. Some drug has caused it, and no drug can cure it." The connection between drug use and insanity is undeniable. Euripides' audience obviously understood that some drugs made their users appear to be mad. This made it easy for the Greeks to embrace the Eastern aspects of the worship of Dionysus, precisely because they understood that Dionysus' followers were filled with the god and thereby made ecstatic. In the same manner as their own recreational drugs had the power to bring individuals under their manic control. The connection between Dionysus and psychotropic drugs is an ancient one. Drugs appear to have been an important part of these gatherings wherever they took place. Even the Roman authorities suspected members of the cult, practicing in Italy, of using strong drugs in their secretive ceremonies. And why did they use these drugs? Did Dionysus' followers rely upon recreational drugs to enhance their spiritual experiences? It's difficult to say with any certainty, because their practices were so secretive that we may never know exactly what happened. But the traditional symbolism surrounding the figure of Dionysus establishes a direct link between the cult and drug use. For example, the Greeks typically associated Dionysus with several specific plants, including ivy, grapevines, and rhythm. Whenever depictions of the god appear in Greek art or whenever he surfaces in ancient texts, we find depictions and representations of these vines as well. Each of these plants produces mind-altering intoxicants, but only the use of wine has managed to stay in vogue. So scholars typically emphasize the use of alcohol when discussing bacchanalian ecstasy. This oversight is an unfortunate accident of history. wine may cause a temporary derangement of certain cognitive abilities, but it is difficult to accept the notion that the Greeks may have associated its use with mania or temporary insanity. In fact, it's much more likely that the sort of ecstasy found in our sources came from drugs made from ivy and bryony, as we see in Pliny. There is a white vine, which the Greeks called veriza, and pelos rus, common bryony. The root, famous for many uses, is pounded and taken in doses of 2 drachma for a snake bite. It removes spots and blotches on the face, freckles, bruises, and scars. It is given also in drink for epilepsy, as well as for nervous disorders and giddiness. In larger doses, however, even the itself sometimes disorders the senses. The ancient world knew that certain botanical substances could induce states of altered perception, and in some cases could produce mental derangement that was closely akin to insanity. It's likely that the followers of Dionysus relied upon these recreational substances to achieve the ecstatic state characterized by the worship of their beloved divinity. The link between Dionysus and psychotropic drugs is significant for one important reason. Athenians celebrated this unique god by performing tragedies. Drama and Dionysus were inseparable entities in antiquity, bound together by annual festivals where the playwrights of Greece met and competed with one another. At the base of the mighty Acropolis in Dionysus' magnificent theater, some of the greatest authors of Western civilization produced their plays for audiences enamored of myths and legends. The power of these performances must have been truly mesmerizing. To see Sophocles' Oedipus walk on the stage, or the mad furies of Achilles chasing Orestes, or the crazed Medea of Euripides, it must have been incredibly momentous. Further archaeological and literary studies of the use of psychotropics in ancient cult practices may lead to the conclusion that the imaginary world of the stage would never have been possible without the use of psychotropic chemicals. Recreational drugs had a significant impact on ancient society, but they are still, and probably always will be, the ugly duckling of studies. Drugs are an academic hot potato. Few classicists ever choose to study this scandalous topic, and far fewer will ever choose to admit the prevalence of drugs in ancient society. Few classicists ever choose to study this scandalous topic, and far fewer will ever choose to admit the prevalence of drugs in ancient society. However, one thing is certain: there are too many references to recreational drugs in the texts to ignore their influence in the classical world. The Greeks and Romans used opium, anticholinergics, and numerous botanical toxins to induce states of mental euphoria, create hallucinations, and alter their own consciousness. This is an indisputable fact. It should not be surprising that our ancestors resorted to chemical recreation, nor should we be afraid to admit that some of the most distinguished members of the ancient world used recreational drugs. After all, these people lived in a time that demanded much more of the psyche as well as the body, and pharmaceutical bliss was nothing more or less than a gift, a chance to relieve the heavy burden posed by the dreadful living conditions of classical civilization. As Aldo Huxley said most eloquently, that humanity at large will ever be able to dispense with artificial paradises seems very unlikely. Most men and women lead lives at the worst so painful, at the best so monotonous, poor and limited, that the urge to escape, the longing to transcend themselves, if only for a few moments, is and always has been one of the principal appetites of the soul. We should not retreat to the comfort of our traditional moral strongholds when trying to understand the past. We should allow the ancient world to reveal itself for what it was, recreational drugs and all. And that's it for today. We'll take it up tomorrow, hopefully, with the Promethean Euphoria Part 4. So that is the conclusion of Part 3. Thanks for listening.
All right. The reading of The Chemical Muse Part 3. That was a wrap. I hope you guys enjoyed our reading. Get motivated. Read a book. Violence is not good. But in order to secure peace, you must prepare for war. You guys, life ain't a joke. Prepare your body, prepare your mind. Try to live in peace.